The stars hung silent in the void as the human ship, Horizon's Edge, drifted through uncharted space, and Captain Maya Stone stood on the bridge watching her screens with tired eyes because 3 months of mapping empty systems had worn down her crew's spirits. But everything changed when the sensors picked up something impossible. Massive crystalline vessel floated dead in space, and its hull bore deep scars from weapons that no human had ever seen, and Maya ordered her team to prepare for boarding, even though every instinct screamed danger because protocols demanded its investigation of all unknown craft, and within an hour she led 6 armed Marines through the airlock into corridors that seemed grown rather than built. The interior glowed with faint blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and the walls were smooth as glass, but warm to the touch, and they moved deeper into the ship, past chambers filled with strange devices and broken machinery, until they found her in what appeared to be a throne room, and she was the most beautiful and terrible thing Maya had ever seen. A woman sat upon a chair of living crystal, and her skin was pale as moonlight, and her hair flowed silver down to her waist, and her ears swept back in elegant points that marked her as something definitely not human, and her eyes were ancient beyond measure, filled with sorrow that could drown worlds, and beside her lay a dragon. The creature was massive, even while resting, and its scales gleamed deep crimson, and the strange light and smoke curled from its nostrils with each breath, and its eyes fixed on the humans with intelligence that made Maya's blood run cold, because this was no animal but something that thought and judged and remembered. The woman spoke, and her voice carried the weight of empires, and her words were in perfect English, though her accent belonged to no nation on earth. And she said, "There are no men left on my world," and Maya felt her team tense because those words hung in the air like a death sentence. The woman introduced herself as Empress Irena, and she ruled what remained of the Althari Empire. Her people had once controlled 1,000 star systems, but now they were hunted and dying, and she explained that an enemy called the Void Swarm had consumed everything, and the swarm fed on life itself, but especially on the males of her species, because they carried a connection to energies that humans could not understand. Maya listened as Lyrina described the fall of her civilization, how world after world had burned, and how the swarm's hunger never ended, and how it tracked the Althari through their connection to what they called the Weave, and now only women remained scattered across dying refuge worlds waiting for the end, because without their males, the Althari could not rebuild, could not reproduce, could not continue. The dragon raised its head, and Lyrina placed a hand on its massive skull, and she said his name was Vermithrax, and he was her oldest companion, and together they had fled the final siege of their homeworld. And she had come seeking allies, but found only humans, and her tone carried disappointment, because the Althari had known of Earth, and had dismissed humanity as primitives who barely understood fusion. Power. Maya felt anger flash through her, but she kept her voice level and asked what the Empress wanted, and Lyrana's answer was simple and terrible, because she needed help evacuating the last sanctuary worlds before the swarm found them, and in exchange she offered knowledge that could advance human civilization by centuries and star charts, showing safe routes through regions humans had never mapped, and the locations of ancient weapons that could turn the tide of any war. But she also warned that helping the Althari would paint a target on humanity itself, because the swarm would learn of Earth, and it would come eventually. And Maya had to decide whether to condemn her own species, to save another, and the weight of that choice pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Maya asked how many Althari remained, and Lyrina's face grew even more haunted, and she said perhaps 100,000 souls spread across 5 worlds, and they were all women, and all that remained of an empire that once numbered in the billions in time was running out, because the swarm had found the trail again in the sanctuary. Worlds had maybe months before the end. The captain looked at her crew and saw fear and wonder in equal measure, and she knew this decision was beyond her authority, but she also knew that leaving these people to die was not something she could live with, and she told Lyrina that she would take her case to Earth Command, and that humanity would consider the alliance, but she made no promises, because her world had its own problems, and getting involved in an alien war could doom them. Lyrina stood, and she was tall and graceful and deadly, and she bowed her head in acknowledgement and said that she understood, and that she asked only for a chance because her people had nowhere else to turn. And Mithrax made a sound deep in his chest that might have been approval or might have been a threat, and Maya could not tell which. The humans escorted the Empress back to their ship, and Maya sent an emergency transmission to Earth Command, marked with priority codes that would reach the admirals within hours. And while they waited, Larina sat in the observation deck and stared out at the stars, and Maya joined her and asked what it felt like to watch an empire die. The Empress was quiet for a long moment, and then she said it felt like drowning slowly and watching everyone you love drown with you, and knowing that all your achievements and all your glory would be forgotten because there would be no one left to remember. And Maya had no answer to that, because what could anyone say to grief that vast 3 days later the response came, and Earth's command authorized a reconnaissance mission to the nearest Othari sanctuary world, and Maya was to take the horizon's edge and make contact with the survivors, assess the situation, and most importantly, determine if the swarm posed a real threat to human space. And Maya knew it was the beginning of something vast and terrible and wonderful all at the end. Searweath words that carried centuries of diplomatic training, but her eyes showed genuine relief, because hope was a rare commodity in a dying civilization, and even this small chance meant everything. And Vermithrax nuzzled against his bondmate, and for just a moment the Empress allowed herself to smile, and it was sad and beautiful and heartbreaking. The Horizon's Edge set course for Silverthorn Prime, and the journey would take 2 weeks through hyperspace, and during that time, Maya learned much about the Othari and their ways, and Larina proved willing to teach and to share knowledge freely, because she understood that trust had to be built and that humanity needed to see her people as more than desperate refugees. Maya asked about the dragon, and Lyrena explained that Vermithrax was not a pet, but a partner, and that their bond went soul deep, and that he was as intelligent as any Althari, and had lived for over 3,000 years, and had seen the rise and fall of dynasties. And the dragon looked at Maya with eyes that held the weight of ages, and she understood then that this creature was as much a refugee as his Empress as they traveled deeper into what had once been Althari space. Maya saw the evidence of the swarms passing, and they found dead worlds stripped of all life and derelict ships drifting in the dark, and stations that had been consumed from the inside out, and the horror of it settled into her bones, because this enemy did not just kill, but erased, and left nothing behind but silence. When they finally arrived at Silverthorn Prime, Maya stood on the bridge and stared at a world of impossible beauty, and the planet was wrapped in perpetual twilight, and crystalline cities grew from the ground like forests, and towers reached toward the sky in spirals of light and color, and it should have been paradise, but Maya could see the scars and the empty spaces where buildings had been torn down for resources and the signs of a civilization preparing for the end. Lyrana stood beside her and said, "Welcome to the last home of my people," and her voice carried pride and sorrow in equal measure. And Maya knew that whatever came next would change both their species forever, and that the easy days of humanity's isolation were over, because the galaxy was full of wonders and horrors, and they had just chosen a side. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Brooks led the ground team down to Silverthorn Prime, and the landing craft descended through skies that shimmered with colors she had no names for. And when they touched down on a platform of living crystal, she stepped out into air that tasted of flowers and something else, something ancient and fading like the last breath of summer. The Othari women who met them were warriors, and their armor seemed to flow like liquid metal, and their weapons hummed with power that made the humans' rifles look like children's toys. And at their heads stood a woman with hair like flame and eyes that could freeze stars, and she introduced herself as General Kelith Dawnblade, and her voice dripped with barely hidden contempt. Gelith looked at the humans and said, "So these are the allies the Empress brings us," and she shook her head and continued, "You are children with crude guns, and you know nothing of the enemy we face." And Lisa felt her team bristle, but she kept her voice calm and said, "We are here to help, if you will let us." And the general laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness. Lisa and her team were given a tour of the sanctuary, and what they saw broke their hearts and mended them again, because, despite Everything despite the loss and the fear, the Althari had not given up, and the cities still functioned, and children still learned, and artisans still created beauty from crystal and light, and there was defiance here and stubborn hope that refused to die. They met teachers who preserved ancient knowledge, and healers who tended the wounded, and engineers kept the cities running on failing power systems, and every woman they met had lost someone in every face, carried grief like a scar, but they smiled when they greeted the humans, and they offered food and shelter, and Lisa understood that hospitality was sacred to these people, even in their darkest hour. In the war room, deep beneath the central spire, Keleth showed them tactical displays of swarm movements, and the maps were covered in red markers showing hive fleets and advanced scouts and feeding zones, and the general pointed to Silverthorn Prime and said they will be here within a month. And we cannot evacuate everyone, and we cannot fight them all, and so we will die. But we will die with weapons in our hands. Lisa studied the displays and asked questions that surprised Keleth, and she wanted to know how the swarm tracked its prey, and how it communicated, and what its weaknesses were, and the general answered grudgingly and said the swarm senses the weave and follows it like bloodhounds. It's following a scent, and that it learns and adapts, and that it has no fear and no mercy. Then Lisa asked what humans looked like to the swarm, and Keleth paused and said, "We do not know, because no one has fought alongside your kind before." And Lisa smiled and said, "Then maybe we have an advantage." And the general frowned, but did not dismiss the idea, because she was a warrior. And warriors understood that sometimes the smallest edge could turn a battle too. Weeks later, the swarm arrived, and the sky above Silverthorn Prime split open with organic vessels that looked like they had been grown rather than built, and they pulsed with hunger, and their hulls were covered in eyes that searched for prey, and klaxons screamed across the sanctuary as defenders rushed to their positions. Lisa stood beside Keleth on the command platform and watched as Althari cruisers rose to meet the enemy, and their weapons carved light through the darkness and struck swarm ships with devastating force. But the enemy kept coming, and for every ship destroyed, 2 more took its place, and the general's face was grim, because she had seen this before and knew how it ended. The first swarm creatures reached the surface, and they were nightmares made flesh, and they had to. Many limbs and mouths that could swallow men whole, and they leaked acid that burned through crystal and stone, and the Althari warriors met them with blade and spell, and died holding the line, because that was all they could do. Lisa called for her marines, and they deployed with weapons that barked thunder and spat metal, and the swarm creatures that had shrugged off Althari energy weapons fell to human bullets and exploded under human grenades. And Keleth watched with wide eyes and said, "Your weapons are primitive but effective." And Lisa grinned and said, "Sometimes simple is better." A marine named Nicole Carter found herself fighting beside Keleth, and together they developed a strategy, and the Althari general ray shields that dampened the weave's signature and made them invisible to swarm sensors, and then Nicole would lead her squad through the blind spots and hit the enemy from angles. They never expected the battle raged for 3 days, and the defenders lost ground slowly, and the swarm adapted to human tactics, but not fast enough, and reinforcements arrived from the horizon's edge, and Maya brought every weapon her ship carried, and she used them all, and the orbital bombardment turned the tide because the swarm had not expected resistance from above. In the 4th day, the enemy withdrew and left behind thousands of dead creatures that dissolved into black ichor, and the Althari stared at the carnage and could not believe they had won, because they had not won a battle in so long. And some of them wept, and others laughed, and all of them looked at the humans with new. A Scaleth found Lisa in the ruins of what had been a garden, and the general's armor was scorched, and her face was streaked with blood. Not all of it her own, and she said, "I was wrong about you and your people." And Lisa shrugged and said, "We all make mistakes." And the 2 women clasped forearms in a warrior's greeting, and something like friendship sparked between them. But the victory came with a terrible cost, and the swarm now knew that humans were involved, and somewhere in the vast network of hive minds, the enemy registered this new species and marked them as threats, and began to allocate resources to their destruction. And Maya understood that Earth had just painted a target on itself that would never fade in the aftermath. Maya stood with Larina on a balcony overlooking the city, and the Empress said, "You have given my people something we had lost." And Maya asked, "What?" And Larina said, "Hope." And Larina said, "Hope, and why are?" Looked out at the damage and the survivors working to rebuild and said, "Hope is not enough, and we both know it." And the Empress nodded and said, "No, but it is a beginning." Vermithrax landed beside them, and the dragon's massive presence made the balcony shake, and he fixed Maya with an ancient gaze and made a sound that rumbled in her chest, and Larina translated and said, "He approves of you," and Maya did not know whether to be honored or terrified, and settled for both. Human Captain received a transmission from Earth Command, and the admirals wanted a full report, and they wanted to know if the alliance was worth the risk. And Maya looked at the Althari working to save their world, and at Keleth drilling warriors in new tactics, and at the children who had not known victory in their lifetimes. And she sent her response and said, "Yes, it is worth it, Earth." His command was divided, and Admiral Helen Cross argued for withdrawal and said humanity could not afford to fight an alien war, and Dr. Amber Hayes argued for engagement and said the technology alone was worth the risk, and the debate raged for days while Maya waited on Silverthorn Prime and tried not to think about what would happen if Earth abandoned these people. Then Amber made a discovery, and she had been studying Althari technology, and she found that the weave was similar to quantum fields humans had theorized, but never mastered, and if they could learn to manipulate it, they could revolutionize everything from communication to weapons. And the admirals listened, because power was a language they understood. The decision came down from the top, and Earth would commit to a limited engagement, and they would send reinforcements and supplies, but in exchange the Althari would share their knowledge freely and teach humanity everything they knew. And Larina agreed, without hesitation, because survival mattered more than pride. Maya gathered her crew and told them that more ships were coming, and that they were going to war, and some of them looked afraid, and others looked eager, and all of them understood that their lives would never be the same. And she asked who would stand with her, and every hand went up, because that was what humans did when facing the darkness. The human fleet arrived at Silverthorn Prime 3 weeks after the battle, and 6 warships dropped out of hyperspace carrying weapons and warriors and supplies. And Admiral Helen Cross commanded from the bridge of her flagship, and her face was hard as stone because she did not trust this alliance, but she would follow orders. Dr. Amber Hayes came with the fleet, and she brought a team of scientists who looked at Althari technology with hungry eyes, and they set up labs in the crystal spires and began studying everything the Empress would share, and what they learned made them understand just how far behind humanity truly was. Larina proposed a mission that made even the bravest warriors hesitate, and she wanted to strike at a swarm hive cluster gathering in the Veil Nebula, and destroying it would buy years of breathing room for the sanctuary worlds. But the hive was protected by thousands of enemy ships, and by creatures called harvesters that could drain life from entire planets. Maya studied the tactical displays and said, "This is suicide." And Larina nodded, said, "Yes, but it is necessary suicide, because if we do nothing, the swarm will overwhelm us within months." And Maya looked at her crew and at the Althari warriors and said, "Then we make them pay for every inch." The alliance began training together, and human soldiers learned to fight alongside Althari warriors, and the cultures clashed in 1,000 small ways because humans were loud and informal, and the Althari were ancient and protocol-bound. But slowly they found common ground and shared purpose. A human pilot named Rachel Kim was assigned to work with an Althari dragon rider named Serana, and at first they argued about everything because Rachel flew fast and aggressive while Serana preferred elegant precision, but in the sky above Silverthorn Prime they learned each other's styles and became something greater than either. Alon Rachel discovered that dragons could link minds with their riders and share thoughts across vast distances, and she asked if a dragon could link with a human, and Serana said it had never been tried, and Rachel grinned and said, "Let's try."
Nice.
And the dragon Wind Whisper lowered his great head, and Rachel placed her hand on his scales. The connection hit like lightning, and Rachel gasped, as ancient memories flooded her mind, and she saw the rise of the Althari Empire and the glory days before the swarm and the long slow fall into darkness and wind whisper. Saw Earth through her eyes and humanity's short, violent history and their stubborn refusal to surrender, and dragon and human understood each other in a way words could never convey. Engineer Sophie Martinez worked with Althari artificers to retrofit human ships with magical shielding, and at first it seemed impossible because the weave required living minds to channel it, but Sophie had an idea, and she used quantum processors to simulate the neural patterns, and the artificers said it should not work, but they tried anyway, and it worked. The shields shimmered into existence around a human destroyer, and they held against weapons that would have torn through conventional armor, and Admiral Cross watched the test and said, "Perhaps this alliance has merit after all," and she authorized full integration of Althari technology into the fleet. Keleth trained human marines in Althari combat techniques, and she taught them how to read enemy movements, and how to strike at weak points, and how to survive when surrounded, and the humans taught her about combined arms tactics and suppressing fire, and she admitted grudgingly that humans understood war differently, but not worse. The combined fleet grew to 30 ships, and half were human, and half Altharian. They bristled with hybrid weapons that married human kinetic force with Altharian energy manipulation, and the dragons numbered 50, and their riders were the finest warriors the sanctuary worlds could spare. Maya met with Lyrina and the other commanders to plan the assault, and they gathered around a holographic display showing the Veil Nebula and the massive structure at its heart. And the Empress said, "The Heart Seed is the command node for this entire region, and destroying it will blind the swarm for years, but getting close enough will cost us everything." Admiral Cross asked about casualties, and Lyrina said, "We will lose half our forces if we are lucky," and Cross said that is unacceptable, and the Empress looked at her with eyes that had seen civilizations burn and said, "Then you do not understand war," and Cross bristled. But Maya stepped between them and said, "We will find a way to improve those odds." Amber suggested, using decoys, and she proposed broadcasting fake weave signatures to draw the swarm fleet away from the Heartseed. And Keleth said the enemy will see through such tricks, and Amber smiled and said, "Not if we make the decoys irresistible," and she explained her plan to use captured swarm biomatter to create signals the hive could not ignore. The plan was risky and complicated and required perfect timing, but it was better than a frontal assault, and Maya approved it, and the fleet began preparations, and engineers worked day and night to build the decoy systems, while warriors trained for the battles to come. Rachel spent her evenings with Serana and Windwhisper, and they flew through the twilight skies of Silverthorn. Prime and the dragon taught her ancient songs that had no words, only emotions, and Rachel taught him human music, and they found beauty in the blending of two cultures separated by stars and time. Sophie discovered something remarkable, and she found that human creativity and Balthri knowledge could produce innovations neither species had achieved alone, and she showed Lyrina a prototype weapon that combined nuclear fusion with Lyrina's disruption, and the Empress stared at it and said this could change everything. The weapon worked by using magical energies to destabilize the target's molecular bonds and then detonating a fusion charge, and the resulting chaos and the cascade effect could tear apart even swarm bioconstructs that regenerated from conventional damage. And Sophie said, "We call it the Sundering charge." And Lyrina said, "It is beautiful and terrible." Maya asked how many they could build before the fleet departed, and Sophie said, "Maybe 20 if we work without rest." And Maya said, "Then we work without rest," and the entire engineering corps threw themselves into production, and Althari and human worked side by side through exhaustion to give their warriors a fighting chance. 2 months after the first human ships arrived, the combined fleet was ready, and Maya stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge and looked at the assembled forces and saw human warships flying in formation with Althari cruisers and dragons circling overhead, and she thought, "This is either genius or madness." Lyrina addressed the fleet over open channels, and her voice carried the weight of empire, and she said, "We stand at the edge of darkness, and before us lies an enemy that has devoured worlds, but we do not stand alone and together. We will show the swarm that some prey fights back," and the cheers that answered her came in 2 languages, but carried the same defiance of Vermithrax stood beside his bondmate, and he spread his massive wings and roared a challenge that echoed through the hangar bays, and every dragon answered, and the sound was thunder and fury and ancient power, and the human crews who heard it felt their blood sing, because this was what legends sounded like. The fleet prepared to jump to the Veil Nebula, and Maya walked through her ship and spoke with her crew, and she saw fear in their eyes, but also determination, because they knew what was at stake. And they trusted her to lead them through the fire, and she hoped desperately that their trust was not misplaced. Rachel found Maya before departure, and the young pilot said, "If we do not come back, I want you to know this was worth it." And Maya asked what? And Rachel said, "Everything and all of it, and getting to be part of something bigger than myself." And Maya hugged her and said, "We are coming back." And Rachel smiled and said, "Of course we are." The jump coordinates were locked, and the fleet aligned, and Maya gave the order, and 30 ships tore through reality into hyperspace and behind them. Silverthorn Prime watched and waited and prayed to gods both human and Altheri, because prayer was all those left behind could offer. The Veil Nebula hung before them like a wound in space, and the clouds of gas glowed with sickly colors that hurt to look at. And Maya felt her stomach twist as the fleet emerged from hyperspace, because nothing could have prepared her for what waited in that poisoned dark. The heartseed dominated the center of the nebula, and it was a mass of living tissue the size of a moon, and it pulsed with malevolent intelligence, and veins of corrupted energy ran across its surface like diseased lightning, and around it swarmed thousands of swarm ships, each one hungry and aware. And Wrong Admiral Cross studied the tactical display, and her face went pale, and she said, "There are too many." And Lyrina stood beside her and said, "Yes." And Cross asked then, "Why are we here?" And the Empress said, "Because surrendering to fear is the same as dying, and we choose to die fighting. If we must die." At all, the decoy drones launched, and they broadcast weave signatures so rich and powerful that the swarm could not resist, and the enemy fleet began to turn like a school of predatory fish, following blood in the water, and thousands of ships peeled away from the Heartseed to pursue the false prey. Maya watched the enemy fleet divide, and she counted seconds, and when enough ships had committed to the chase, she gave the order, and the real strike force activated their hybrid stealth systems, and human technology hid their engines, while Altheri magic dampened their weave signatures, and they became ghosts in the void. The strike force moved toward the Heartseed, and it consisted of 12 ships and 30 dragons, and the finest warriors both species could field, and their mission was simple in concept and impossible in execution, because they had to penetrate the enemy's defenses and plant sundering charges in the structure's core. But the swarm was learning and adaptive, and when the strike force was halfway to their target, the remaining enemy ships turned as one and rushed to intercept. And Maya realized with cold horror that they had been expected, and the trap was not for the swarm, but for the Alliance. The battle began in silence, because space carried no sound, and human ships opened fire with railguns and missiles, while Altheri cruisers carved the darkness with energy weapons, and the swarm ships exploded in showers of organic matter and corrupted light. But more kept coming, and the strike force found itself surrounded. Lisa led boarding teams onto swarm bioships, and the interior was a nightmare of pulsing flesh and acid that burned through armor and creatures that should not exist, and her marines fought through corridors that writhed and bled, and they planted fusion charges in neural clusters that screamed silently when they died. A harvester organism emerged from the Heartseed, and it was massive beyond belief, and its body was covered in feeding tentacles that reached for the human ships, and wherever they touched, life drained away. And crews aged and died in seconds, and their ships became tombs drifting cold in the dark Alith. And her dragon riders struck at the harvester, and their weapons carved deep wounds in its flesh, but it regenerated faster than they could damage it, and dragonfire washed over its surface and barely scorched it. And the general realized conventional attacks were useless and called for the sundering Chargus Vermithrax, and Lyrina flew straight at the Heartseed, and the Empress channeled centuries of grief and rage into attacks that tore reality itself, and she struck with power that made the structure shudder and Vermithrax breathed fire hot enough to melt starship hulls, and together they carved a path through the defenses. Rachel and Wind Whisper fought beside Serana and her dragon. Stormwing and the human pilot had learned to channel the weave through her fighter systems and her weapons. Hit harder than they should, and she moved with a grace that surprised even the Althari. And in the chaos of battle, she smiled because this was where she belonged. Sophie coordinated the engineering teams, and she directed the placement of sundering charges and calculated detonation sequences, and she worked through exhaustion and fear. Because if she made a mistake, thousands would die, the mission would fail, and the swarm would hunt them across the galaxy forever. The Harvester wrapped tentacles around an Althari cruiser and began draining it, and Keleth watched her people die, and she made a decision, and she ordered her dragon to carry a sundering charge directly to the creature's core and her officers. Protested, but she said some sacrifices are necessary, and she dove toward the monster. Maya saw what Keleth intended, and she screamed orders to stop her, but the general was already committed, and her dragon struck the Harvester like a meteor, and the sundering charge detonated, and the cascade reaction tore through the creature's body, and it died thrashing and dissolving and taking Keleth and her dragon with it. The death of the Harvester bought them seconds, and Maya ordered all ships to press the attack, and she pushed her crew beyond their limits. And the horizon's edge shook under the strain but held. Together through will and prayer in the engineering section, reported systems failing across the board, but they kept fighting. Lyrina reached the Heartseed's outer membrane, and she tore through it with raw power, and inside was a chamber that pulsed like a heartbeat, and in its center was a neural cluster that commanded the entire region, and she prepared to destroy it, but swarm defenders swarmed from the walls, and Vermithrax roared defiantly. Says, team fought their way to the structure's core from below, and they lost half their number 2 swarm creatures and acid and traps, but they kept pushing, and when they reached the chamber they found Lyrina already there, and together, human and Althari planted the final charge as Sophie detected a problem, and the sundering charges needed a trigger signal from close range, and someone had to stay behind to activate them, and the timer was not enough because the swarm was already adapting and would disable the charges before they detonated. And Maya felt her blood turn to ice. The captain made her decision, and she prepared to pilot a fighter loaded with the trigger mechanism into the Heartseed's core, and she would activate the charges manually and give her fleet time to escape, and it was the only way, and she accepted it without hesitation. Erna heard Maya's plan over the command channel, and she refused. Said the Empress had lived for centuries and lost everything, and this final act should be hers. And Maya argued, and said the Althari needed their leader, and their voices rose until both were shouting across the void. Rachel heard the argument, and she made her choice in the space between heartbeats, and she was already in her fighter and already loaded with trigger systems, and she locked out external commands and plotted her course before anyone could stop her, and she whispered, "Forgive me." The young pilot transmitted on all channels and said, "My life for 1,000 worlds, and tell my mom I love her," and she punched her engines too full and dove toward the Heartseed before Maya or Lyrina could react, and Wind Whisper flew beside her because he would not let his partner die. Lone Maya screamed for Rachel to abort, and Lyrina commanded her to return. And Admiral Cross ordered her to stand down, but Rachel ignored them all, and she flew through storms of enemy fire, and her fighter's shields failed. And her hull took damage, but she pushed through because she had a mission, and nothing would stop her. Rachel reached the core chamber, and she activated the trigger, in 20 sundering charges detonated in perfect sequence, and the cascade reaction ripped through the Heartseed structure, and dimensional barriers collapsed, and energy feedback tore the massive organism apart from the inside. The explosion was beautiful and terrible, and it consumed Rachel and Wind Whisper and 10,000 swarm ships, and the light reached across the nebula and painted the gas clouds in colors of ending and beginning, and Maya watched it through tears and felt her heart break. Surviving fleet fled as the Heartseed died in its death throes sent shockwaves through space that tossed ships like toys, and they jumped to hyperspace one by one and left the Veil Nebula burning behind them. And when they were safe, Maya collapsed in her command chair, and could not speak. The fleet limped back to Silverthorn Prime, and every ship bore scars, and every crew carried grief. And when they emerged from hyperspace, the Sanctuary World's defenders saw the gaps in their formation and understood the cost of victory before anyone spoke. Maya stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge, and she had not slept in 3 days, and her uniform was stained with blood and sweat, and her eyes were hollow because she kept seeing Rachel's final moments over and over, and she wondered if the trade had been worth it. Lyrana came to her in the quiet hours after arrival, and the Empress looked like she had aged centuries in the weeks since the battle, and she placed a hand on Maya's shoulder and said nothing, because sometimes silence was the only honest response to loss. The Alliance held a memorial service, and they gathered on a crystal platform overlooking the sanctuary city and humans, and Althari stood together as names were read, and Rachel Kim's name echoed across the assembly, and Maya felt her throat close because the pilot had been so young and so bright, and now she was gone. Sirana spoke for the Althari, who had bonded with humans, and she said that Rachel had shown them what courage looked like, and that Wind Whisper had died proud to fly beside such a warrior. And her voice broke, and she could not continue, and a human Marine stepped forward and finished the eulogy, because grief was a language everyone spoke. The casualties numbered in the thousands, and 12 ships had been lost, and half the Dragon Riders were dead, and countless crew members would never see home again. But the Heartseed was destroyed, and the swarm's advance had been stopped, and the sanctuary worlds had gained years of breathing room. Admiral Cross addressed the combined forces, and she said that humanity had taken its first step onto the galactic stage, and that they had proven themselves worthy of standing among the stars, and that the alliance with the Althari would endure because bonds forged in battle could not be easily broken. Dr. Amber presented her findings, and the technology recovered from the mission would revolutionize human civilization, and she showed them new shield designs and faster engines and weapons that could level cities and communication systems that worked across light years instantly, and the cost had been terrible, but the gain was immeasurable. Maya met with Earth Command over subspace communication, and the admirals wanted a full report, and they asked if the alliance should continue, and Maya looked at them through the screen and said that abandoning the Althari now would be a betrayal worse than any defeat, and she said it without hesitation. The admirals conferred, and they argued, and they debated, and finally they agreed, and Earth would commit fully to the alliance. They would send more ships and more supplies, and they would defend the sanctuary worlds because humanity had chosen a side and would not waver. Lyrana called a council of the surviving Althari leaders, and they gathered in the throne room beneath the central spire, and she told them that their civilization would never be what it was, but that it could become something new, and that the humans had given them not just hope, but a future. The Empress proposed full integration between the species and shared colonies, and combined military forces and cultural exchange, and some of the elders objected because the Althari had always stood apart, but Lyrana said that isolation had brought them to the edge of extinction, and only unity could save them. Keleth's death weighed heavily on the survivors, and her sacrifice had bought them victory, but the cost was devastating because she had been the finest general of her generation, and Maya attended the traditional Theri burning ceremony and watched as Keleth's armor was consumed by dragon fire, and she understood that some debts could never be repaid. Lisa took command of the ground forces, and she promoted Nicole to her second, and together they began training the next generation of warriors, and they taught them the lessons learned in blood. And they made sure that Keleth's tactics would not be forgotten. Sophie and the Althari artificers continued their work, and they built new ships that combined the best of both technologies, and the first hybrid vessel launched 3 months after the battle. It was fast and deadly and beautiful, and they named it the Rachel Kim's new ship. Became a symbol, and more were built, and within a year, the Alliance fleet numbered 50 vessels, and each one was stronger than anything either species could have built alone, and the swarm learned to fear them because these ships did not run and did not surrender. Maya received promotion to Commodore, and she commanded a battle group consisting of human and Althari ships working in perfect coordination, and she led them on missions to evacuate the remaining sanctuary worlds in every operation. Succeeded because the Alliance had learned to fight as one. Rachel's mother came to Silverthorn Prime, and Maya met her at the landing pad, and she expected anger or blame, but the woman simply hugged her, said, "Thank you for giving my daughter something worth dying for," and Maya wept because she had been holding it in for months. Memorial Wall grew and more names were added as the war continued, because the swarm was vast and would not be defeated easily, but each name represented someone who had chosen to fight and who had believed that the future was worth defending. Lorana stood before the wall, and she placed her hand on Rachel's name, and for the first time since her world fell, she allowed herself to cry, and the tears fell. Like rain, and Maya stood beside her, silent and steady, because some moments needed no words. Children played in the streets of the sanctuary city, and they were human and Althari both. They spoke a mixture of languages, and they did not understand that their friendship was supposed to be impossible, and Maya watched them and thought, "This is what we are fighting forth." Alliance established new colonies on worlds abandoned by the swarm, and they built cities that blended human efficiency with Althari beauty, and families settled there and began new lives, and slowly the refugee population found homes and purpose. Ever Mithrax spent his days teaching young dragons, and he was patient and wise, and he made sure that the ancient knowledge would not die with his generation, and sometimes Maya would visit him, and they would sit in comfortable silence, because the dragon understood loss as well as any being alive. Sent diplomats and politicians, and they wanted to negotiate treaties and trade agreements, and Lorena met with them, and she was gracious and firm, and she made sure the Alliance would benefit both species equally, because she had learned that survival required fairness. The war continued, and skirmishes erupted along the border, and the swarm tested the Alliance defenses, and sometimes they won, and sometimes they lost, but they never broke, because humans and Xperi fought side by side and covered each other's weaknesses. Maya stood on a balcony overlooking the city, and she thought about everything that had changed, and she remembered the scared captain who had first met an alien Empress, and she smiled because that person seemed like a stranger. Now Lorana joined her, and they watched the sunset paint the crystal spires in gold and purple, and the Empress said, "You gave my people something we had lost," and Maya said, "You gave mine something we never had," and they both understood they were talking about the same thing. The future stretched before them, uncertain and dangerous, but no longer hopeless, and the Alliance had proven that different species could work together, and that courage was a universal language, and that some bonds transcended the spaces between stars. Maya received reports of swarm movements and new threats emerging, and she knew the war was far from over, and she gathered her commanders, and they planned the next mission and the one after that, because this was their purpose. Nin, the Hangar Bay human pilots, and Althari riders prepared their craft, and they joked and argued and supported each other, and they wore patches showing Rachel's name and Keleth's crest, because heroes deserve to be remembered. Though fleet prepared to launch, and Maya walked through her ship one last time, and she saw her crew working together with Althari engineers, and she heard laughter and saw determination, and she knew they would prevail because they had already survived the impossible. Irna addressed the Alliance over open channels, and she said, "There are no men left on my world, but there are warriors, and there are allies, and there is hope, and together we will show thee swarm that some prey does not go quietly into the dark." The ships launched, and they flew in perfect formation, and dragons soared alongside them, and the combined fleet moved out toward the border where the swarm waited, and Maya sat in her command chair and thought about Rachel and Keleth and everyone they had lost. She keyed the fleet-wide channel and said, "This is for them and for everyone who comes after, and we fight not because we know we will win, but because losing is not an option." And her crew answered with a cheer that echoed through every ship. The stars wheeled overhead, and the future was uncertain, but the Alliance endured, and humanity had taken its place among the ancient races, and the Althari had found new purpose, and together they faced the darkness and refused to blink. Maya looked at Lorena's face on the view screen, and the Empress smiled, and it was sad and beautiful and full of determination, and Maya smiled back, and together They led their people forward into whatever came next, because that was what leaders did. The memorial wall would grow longer, and the war would claim more lives than the swarm. Not surrender easily, but the Alliance had learned a truth that would carry them through the darkness, and that